She gave up on love years ago. Honestly, at this point, it's a little sad. My sister didn't say this quietly. She said it across a dining room full of relatives, her voice carrying easily over the sound of dishes being passed and wine being poured. It was Canadian Thanksgiving. 30-something people were at that table, aunts, uncles, cousins. I saw a handful of times a year, my parents and my sister's fiancé, who was still new enough to our family, that he was trying very hard to say the right things to everyone. Every single one of them heard her. A few cousins looked at their plates. An uncle found something fascinating at the bottom of his glass. My mother gave the small, uncomfortable laugh she always gave when she didn't want to get involved. My sister tilted her head in my direction and smiled. Maybe this time next year you'll finally have someone to bring home. She said it with warmth in her voice, the way she always made those comments sound, casual, almost fond. I set down my fork. I took one slow breath, then I looked directly at her and said, I've been married for 8 months. Nobody laughed after that. My name is Quinn Aldridge. I'm 33 years old. I work as a project manager for a commercial real estate development company in downtown Toronto, coordinating construction timelines, managing multi-million-dollar budgets, keeping contractors and city planners and building owners at the same table long enough to get anything done. I bought my own condo in the east end of the city 3 years ago. I pay my mortgage every month on a salary I earned entirely on my own. I built a life I'm proud of. None of that was ever the thing my family wanted to discuss. Growing up, my sister moved through every room, like she already knew what everyone was thinking, and had already decided to charm them. She was easy to love, quick with a joke, warm with strangers, the kind of person who could make a whole table feel like they were in on something together. I was quieter. I was the one who helped clear the dishes, who called home on Sundays, who moved away for university at Waterloo and didn't cause problems. I wasn't difficult, I just wasn't as entertaining. For a while I thought that dynamic would shift as we got older. Instead it calcified. Every family gathering followed the same script. My sister would arrive with news, a promotion, a trip, a relationship milestone, and the room would gather around her. I would arrive and within 10 minutes my mother would ask if I was seeing anyone. Not how's work, not how's the condo, not how are you holding up. Just, are you seeing anyone? When I said no, the conversation went the same direction every time. My aunt would say something well-meaning about how I was too focused on my career and needed to make time for the important things. My father would pat my shoulder the way he did when he didn't know what else to do. My sister would let it play out for a few minutes and then land a comment that was technically light, but always had an edge. The table would laugh. I would smile. We would move on. I stopped expecting anything different. After a while, I stopped explaining my life to them at all. I showed up, I helped in the kitchen, I drove home. It was easier that way. What nobody in my family knew was that my life had already changed in ways I hadn't told any of them about. I met my husband the way a lot of things happen in real life, through work, at a time when neither of us was looking for anything. His name is Reed Calloway. He's a landscape architect from Kelowna who moved to Toronto for graduate school and never left. He was brought onto a mixed-use development project my company was managing in Mississauga, and I first encountered him at a site coordination meeting, where he was the only person in the room who had clearly read every document before he sat down. He had printed notes. He had specific questions. He was mildly infuriating in the best way. We worked in proximity for 4 months as the project moved through its phases. We started talking properly during a particularly brutal week when the general contractor had miscommunicated with the structural engineering team, and the whole schedule was in jeopardy. We ended up eating gas station sandwiches in a parking garage at 10 o'clock on a Thursday, trying to work out a revised timeline that would still satisfy the city's approval window. At some point we stopped talking about the project entirely. I don't remember exactly when that shift happened, only that it did. Reed is calm in a way that isn't passive. He simply doesn't spend energy on things that don't need it. He also notices things. He noticed the way I tensed when I talked about my family. He noticed the subject changes when he asked about holidays. About 6 months after we started dating, I brought him to a birthday dinner for my mother. It was smaller than the holidays, just close family. My sister was there with her then boyfriend. Reed was easy with everyone, unhurried, comfortable without needing to be the center of attention. I think that confused my sister slightly. On the drive back to Toronto that night, Reed was quiet for a few minutes. Then he said, "Does your sister speak to you like that all the time?" I told him it was just how she joked around. He looked at the highway ahead and said, "It doesn't sound like joking to me. It sounds like a habit." I didn't answer right away. Not because he was wrong. He wasn't wrong at all, but because no one had ever said it plainly like that before. Everyone around me had normalized it for so long that hearing it named felt almost disorienting. He didn't push me to do anything about my family after that. He didn't tell me to cut anyone off or to confront anyone directly. He just started asking, after family events, whether I felt better or worse having gone. And I had to be honest with myself. I always felt worse. Not devastated, not dramatically wounded. Just quietly depleted, in the way you feel after spending hours being someone you don't quite recognize. What I had been, for years, was used to it. That's a very different thing from being fine. When Reed proposed, we were in Banff. We had taken a long weekend in September, a last stretch of warmth before Alberta proper turned, and we were walking along the Bow River Trail on a Saturday morning when he stopped and asked me there, with no staging and no audience. Just the mountains and the cold coming off the water and the two of us. I said yes, before he had finished the sentence. We planned the wedding carefully and kept it small on purpose. 11 people. Our closest friends, a few colleagues who had become real friends over the years, his sister and her husband who flew in from Kelowna, and one couple from my Toronto life who had been there through enough of my quieter years to understand why the day looked the way it did. We got married on a Saturday in October at a small venue outside Canmore, and it was the most genuinely joyful day I can remember in years. Nobody compared me to anyone. Nobody asked what had taken so long. Nobody needed me to justify myself. We made a decision together after the ceremony. We wouldn't tell my family right away, not to create a moment later and not because we were ashamed of anything. It was simpler than that. I didn't want the first thing I said about my marriage to be a response to a joke. I didn't want my sister's inevitable comment, or my mother's flustered energy, or the question of why they hadn't been invited to immediately overshadow what the day had actually been. I wanted to keep the quiet of it a little longer. Reed understood that without me needing to over-explain. Neither of us planned exactly when they would find out. As it turned out, we didn't need to. That October, my parents hosted Thanksgiving the way they always did. The brine for the turkey started 2 days early. My father hauled the extra chairs up from the basement, and by the time people arrived, the house already smelled like sage and roasted garlic. I drove up from Toronto alone, because Reed had a site visit in Barrie that afternoon, and was coming straight thereafter. We had talked about whether he should come at all, and we had decided together that he should. I simply hadn't mentioned it to my family. I walked in with a bottle of Ontario Riesling and a butter tart pie from a bakery near my condo. I hugged my mother, nodded to my father, found the cousins already on the couch. My sister was in the kitchen looking pleased with herself, which was her default at family gatherings. Her fiancé was near the island, making careful conversation with one of my uncles, clearly working hard to be likable to people he was still learning. My sister had gotten engaged in the spring, and I suspected this particular Thanksgiving served a secondary purpose. It was a chance for my father's side of the family to properly meet him, to take measure of the person she had chosen. The early part of the evening revolved around them. I didn't mind. I helped with the food, kept my glass filled, let the attention go where it naturally went. We sat down around 6. The table was loud and warm and overfull the way large family dinners always are. I was seated near the middle, across from 2 cousins and diagonal from my sister. I'm not sure exactly when the conversation turned. My aunt asked how things were in Toronto. I said work was busy, a big commercial project wrapping up before the end of the quarter. She nodded politely. And then my sister, with the ease of someone who had been waiting for an opening, said, she's always busy with work. That's why she never meets anyone. A few people smiled. I said evenly that I was happy with my life. I know, my sister said, waving it away. You've always been good at being on your own. That's honestly a skill. She turned slightly to address more of the table. She gave up on love years ago. At this point, it's a little sad. She said it lightly, the way she always did, fond, almost gentle, like she was speaking on my behalf. Then she tilted her head at me. Maybe next year you'll finally have someone to bring home. Someone at the far end of the table chuckled. I looked at my sister. Then I looked at my mother, who was pressing her lips together. My father, who was studying his plate. I said quietly enough that people had to stop their side conversations to hear me. Actually, I've been married for 8 months. The table took a moment to process it. Then my aunt said, I'm sorry? My sister let out a short laugh. Quinn, she said, and her tone was patient in a way that was also dismissive. The tone of someone managing a child who had said something embarrassing. You don't have to say things like that. It's fine. Nobody's judging you. I'm not saying it for sympathy, I said. Then where is he? My father asked. His voice was strange, not unkind, but uncertain, like someone who had picked up a familiar object and found that it was heavier than he remembered. He's on his way, I said. He had a site visit in Barrie this afternoon. He should be here within the hour. The table went very quiet. My sister was looking at me with a particular kind of blankness. The expression of someone who has lost the thread of the story they thought they were telling, and is trying to locate it again. Her fiancé had gone very still beside her. I picked up my phone. I had our wedding photos saved in a folder. I passed the phone to my aunt, who was sitting closest, and let it travel around the table on its own. The photo that came up first was from outside the Canmore venue, just after the ceremony. Reed and I were both laughing at something someone had said off camera. Neither of us was looking at the camera. My wedding band was visible. His was too. I watched the phone move from hand to hand. I watched my mother cover her mouth. I watched my sister's expression move through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment before settling into a guarded, careful stillness. Nobody seemed to know what to say. Then, from the front hallway, the door opened. Footsteps. The sound of something being set on the entryway table. And then Reed appeared in the archway between the hallway and the dining room, still in his work clothes. A gray Henley, his jacket over his arm, mud on his boots that he had stopped to wipe at the mat. He was carrying a white bakery box from a shop near my parents' house, whose name I had texted him 3 weeks earlier. He looked at the table full of people, then he found my face and smiled. Sorry I'm late, he said. The 400 was a mess all the way to Barrie. He set the bakery box on the counter and came to stand beside me. He kissed me on the side of my head the way he always did when he arrived, somewhere I was already waiting. Then he looked around the table and introduced himself the way Reed always introduces himself. Unhurried, direct, making eye contact. I'm Reed, he said, Quinn's husband. It's really good to finally meet all of you. The words settled over the table. My sister's fiancé looked at Reed, then at my sister, then at me. His expression was careful in a way that told me he was thinking very hard about something. My sister had not moved. She was still sitting exactly as she had been when I first said the words, and she was looking at Reed with the blankness of someone who has realized they have been telling a story that was never quite true. Reed pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. Someone passed him the turkey. He thanked them and helped himself and asked my uncle about the Barrie drive, and the conversation started moving again, slowly, unevenly, but nothing about it was the same as it had been 20 minutes earlier. Later, after the dishes were cleared and people had moved into the living room, my father's eldest sister found me near the kitchen doorway. She lowered her voice and asked whether my sister had always treated me this way, and when I told her the truth, most of my adult life, she was quiet for a moment before saying, I always told myself it was just how sisters are. That wasn't fair to you. One of my cousins came and stood nearby. He said he remembered a comment my sister had made at my university graduation. Something about how I'd probably spend my whole career correcting other people's mistakes without getting any recognition for it. He had laughed at the time because he thought she was being affectionate. He said now he wasn't so sure that had been right. Someone else remembered a family barbecue years ago where my sister had shared details of a difficult period in my personal life, framed as a funny story, to a table of people I hadn't chosen to tell. Another relative recalled a birthday where my sister had made a comment about my appearance in front of friends who hadn't asked for an opinion. Each memory was small on its own. Together they had a shape that everyone in that room had been quietly agreeing not to name. My sister heard some of it from across the room. She stood with her arms crossed and said nothing. She didn't deny any of it. She also didn't apologize. Her fiancé was the person I thought about most in the days afterward. He was a decent person. I'd gotten that sense from our few brief interactions, and he was standing in my parents' living room realizing that the version of my sister he had agreed to marry was not the complete picture. What he said to her after they left that night, I don't know. I learned weeks later, through my cousin, that he had asked her about it directly and told her he needed more time before they set a date. That the stories he heard at Thanksgiving had changed how he had understood some things. I didn't feel any satisfaction in that. Watching someone else's plans fall into uncertainty wasn't the outcome I wanted. I had spent too many years with my own version of that feeling to find it gratifying in someone else. 3 days after Thanksgiving, my sister called. I let it go to voicemail. She said I had clearly orchestrated the entire evening to humiliate her, that I had always been jealous of what she had, and that this was my way of finally winning something. She said it calmly, which I think she believed made it more credible. I listened to it twice, then I deleted it. She wasn't entirely wrong that the timing had been humiliating for her. She was completely wrong about my intentions. I hadn't planned any of it. I had answered the question she asked. That was the whole of it. In the weeks that followed, my phone was quieter than I expected, and then it wasn't. My aunt texted and asked if I wanted to have lunch, just the two of us. A cousin sent a long message that started with, "I've been thinking about what happened at Thanksgiving, and I want to say something." Then another cousin, an uncle I hadn't spoken to outside family gatherings in years. Some of the messages were more honest than others. Some were clearly uncomfortable to write. But the ones that landed, the ones that said simply, "I saw what was happening for years and I should have said something," those meant more to me than I would have predicted. Not because they changed the past. Because they were true. My mother called on a Tuesday in November and asked if she and my father could meet me for coffee that weekend. Her voice was different than usual. Quieter, more careful, like someone who had been choosing words for a while and wanted to get them right. We met at a cafe near their house, one of those neighborhood spots that had been there for 20 years and hadn't changed much. We ordered and sat and talked about nothing for the first few minutes: the weather, the drive, whether the parking meter was working properly out front. Then my father set down his cup and said, "We owe you an apology." I had imagined hearing those words many times over the years. Now that they were in front of me, they sat there strangely, not quite settling the way I had always assumed they would. My mother said, "We made excuses for too long. We told ourselves it wasn't serious. We told ourselves you were strong enough to handle it, that addressing it directly would only make things worse. We were wrong." My father said, "We should have stepped in years ago." I looked at them both. I believed that they meant what they were saying. I also knew, after enough time, that believing someone is sincere and trusting that they will actually change are two separate things. I had learned that distinction well enough that I could name it clearly. "I forgive you," I said. "I mean that. Not because it was nothing, but because I don't want to keep carrying it." They looked relieved, and then I said, "But I want you to understand that forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. I'm not going to go back to pretending things are fine when they're not. I'm not going to shrink myself to keep the peace. If you want a real relationship with me going forward, it has to look different from what we've had." My father nodded without arguing. "I understand," my mother said quietly. "I hope so," I said, "because I mean it, and the next few years will show me whether you do." We hugged in the car park before we each drove our separate ways. It wasn't a resolution, it was a beginning, and a conditional one. That felt more honest to me than any neat ending would have. The next Thanksgiving, Reed and I hosted at our place in Toronto. We invited 6 people: his sister and her husband, who flew in again from Kelowna, 2 close friends from our Toronto life, and my aunt and her husband, who had earned a place at our table not through shared blood but through what she had done with it. We cooked for 2 days. Reed did the turkey brine from scratch, because he had read 5 different recipes, and decided he understood brining better than all of them, which was both endearing and slightly maddening, and very much like him. We put real candles on the table and opened a good bottle of wine from an Ontario winery we had visited in the summer, and sat somewhere that fit all of us without anyone needing to squeeze. At some point in the evening, I looked around the table and noticed that I hadn't tensed once since that morning. I hadn't rehearsed responses to potential comments in my head on the drive over. I hadn't quietly mapped out the exits in case things went badly. I was just there, in a home Reed and I had made together, with people who had never needed me to be less so they could feel like more. Reed caught my eye from across the table and raised his glass toward me slightly. "People ask me sometimes whether I regret not telling my family about the wedding sooner, whether keeping it private for 8 months was the right decision. I understand why they ask. What I know is this: the day Reed and I got married was exactly what it was supposed to be. Quiet and ours, and untouched by anyone who would have found a way to make it about something other than what it was." That morning outside Canmore, with 11 people around us and the mountains at our backs, nobody asked me what had taken so long. Nobody compared me to my sister. Nobody needed me to account for myself. We said what we meant to each other, and it was witnessed by people who had chosen to be there because they wanted to be, not because they were obligated to show up. I had spent most of my adult life believing that the thing I wanted most was for my family to finally see me clearly. I still think that's a reasonable thing to want. But I understand now that being seen starts with refusing to disappear. It starts with being honest when something is wrong, and not laughing when you're hurting, and not making yourself smaller, to spare someone else from being uncomfortable. My sister had spent years telling a story about me. In that story, I was the one who couldn't be chosen, the one who had given up, the one who needed managing. She had told it so many times that parts of it had stuck to me too, even when I knew better. What I know now is that the story she was telling was never really about me at all. It was about what she needed me to be. And the moment I stopped being that, the story simply had nowhere left to go. The quiet that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of something finally settling into its true shape. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, that shape felt entirely like mine.